Good evening, brave listeners. Welcome back to Timeless Terrors. Tonight we continue our special three-part presentation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. In part 1, we witnessed Ward's growing obsession with his ancestor Joseph Curwen, and the first signs of something ancient and deeply unnatural may be awakening beneath the surface of Providence. Now the mystery deepens, and the shadows surrounding Ward grow darker still. Lovecraft understood better than most that the most terrifying discoveries are often made slowly. One forgotten document, one whispered name, one locked door at a time. So dim the lights once more, settle in close and cozy, and prepare yourself for part 2 of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, Part 2, written by H.P. Lovecraft, performed for you by Jonathan Dunne, originally year of publication 1941. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026, Jonathan Dunne. Chapter 3, A Search and an Evocation. Charles Ward, as we have seen, first learned in 1819 of his descent from Joseph Curwen. That he at once took an intense interest in everything pertaining to the bygone mystery is not to be wondered at, for every vague rumour that he had heard of Curwen now became something vital to himself, in whom flowed Curwen's blood. In his first delvings there was not the slightest attempt at secrecy. He talked freely with his family, though his mother was not particularly pleased to own an ancestor like Curwen, and with the officials of the various museums and libraries he visited. In applying to private families for records thought to be in their possession, he made no concealment of his object, and shared the somewhat amused skepticism with which the account of the old diarists and letter writers were regarded. When he came across the Smith Diary and Archives, and encountered the letter from Jedediah Orne, he decided to visit Salem and look up Curwen's early activities and connections there, which he did during the Easter vacation of 1919. At the Essex Institute, which was well known to him from former sojourns in the glamorous old town of crumbling Puritan gables and clustered gambrel roofs, he was very kindly received and unearthed there a considerable amount of Curwen data. He found that his ancestor was born in Salem Village, now Danvers, 7 miles from town, on the 18th of February, O.S., 1662-3, and that he had run away to sea at the age of 15, not appearing again for 9 years, when he returned with the speech, dress, and manners of a native Englishman, and settled in Salem proper. At that time he had little to do with his family, but spent most of his hours with the curious books he had brought from Europe, and the strange chemicals which came for him on ships from England, France, and Holland. Certain trips of his into the country were the objects of much local inquisitiveness, and were whisperingly associated with vague rumours of fires on the hills at night. Curwen's only close friends had been one Edward Hutchinson of Salem Village, and one Simon Orne of Salem. Hutchinson had a house well out toward the woods, and it was not altogether liked by sensitive people because of the sounds heard there at night. He was said to entertain strange visitors, and the lights seen from his windows were not always of the same colour. The knowledge he displayed concerning long-dead persons and long-forgotten events was considered distinctly unwholesome, and he disappeared about the time the witchcraft panic began, never to be heard from again. At that time Joseph Curwen also departed, but his settlement in Providence was soon learned of. Simon Orne lived in Salem until 1720, when his failure to grow visibly old began to excite attention. He thereafter disappeared, though 30 years later his precise counterpart and self-styled son turned up to claim his property. The claim was allowed on the strength of documents in Simon Orne's known hand, and Jedediah Orne continued to dwell in Salem till 1771, when certain letters from Providence citizens to the Reverend Thomas Barnard and others brought about his quiet removal to parts unknown. Certain documents by and about all of these strange matters were available at the Essex Institute, the courthouse, and the registry of deeds, and included both harmless commonplaces such as land titles and bills of sale, and furtive fragments of a more provocative nature. There were 4 or 5 unmistakable allusions to them on the witchcraft trial records, as when one Hepzibah Lawson swore on July 16th, 1692, at the court of Oyer and Terminin, under Judge Hathorne, that 40 witches and the black man were wont to meet in the woods behind Mr. Hutchinson's house. And one Amity Howe declared at a session of August 8th before Judge Gedney that Mr. G.B., George Burroughs, on that night put the devil his mark upon Bridget S., Jonathan A., Simon O., Deliverance W., Joseph C., Susan P., Mehetable C., and Deborah B. Then there was a catalogue of Hutchinson's uncanny library, as found after his disappearance, and an unfinished manuscript in his handwriting, couched in a cipher none could read. Ward had a photostatic copy of this manuscript made, and began to work casually on the cipher as soon as it was delivered to him. After the following August, his labours on the cipher became intense and feverish, and there is reason to believe from his speech and conduct that he hit upon the key before October or November. He never stated, though, whether or not he had succeeded. But of greatest immediate interest was the oral material. It took Ward only a short time to prove from identity of penmanship a thing he had already considered established from the text of the letter to Curwen, namely that Simon Orne and his supposed son were one and the same person. As Orne had said to his correspondent, it was hardly safe to live too long in Salem, hence he resorted to a 30-year sojourn abroad, and did not return to claim his lands except as a representative of a new generation. Orne had apparently been careful to destroy most of his correspondence, but the citizens who took action in 1771 found and preserved a few letters and papers which excited their wonder. There were cryptic formulae and diagrams in his and other hands which Ward now either copied with care or had photographed, and one extremely mysterious letter in a chirography that the searcher recognized from items in the registry of deeds as positively Joseph Curwen's. Providence, 1st of May. Brother, my honoured auntie and friend, due respects and earnest wishes to him whom we serve for your eternal power. I am just come upon that which you ought to know, concerning the matter of the last extremity and to what do regard it. I am not disposed to follow you in going away on account of my years, for Providence hath not yet ye sharpness of ye bay, in hunting out uncommon things and bringing to trial. I am tied up in ships and goods, and could not do as you did, besides the which my farm at Pawtuxet hath under it what you know, that would not wait for my coming back as an other. But I am not unready for hard fortunes, as I have told you, and have long worked upon ye way of getting back after ye last. I last night struck on ye words that brings up Yog Sothoth, and saw for ye first time that face spoke of by Eben Shakabak in ye, and it said that ye 3rd Psalm in ye Liber Damnatus holds ye clavicle, with sun in 5th house, Saturn in trine. Draw ye pentagram of fire, and say ye 9th verse thrice. This verse repeat each Rudimas and Hallows Eve, and ye thing will breed in ye outside spheres. And of ye, seed of old, shall one be born who shall look back, though knowing not what he seeks. Yet will this avail nothing if there be no heir, and if the salts or the way to make the salts be not ready for his hand. And here I will own I have not taken need steps nor found much. Ye process is plaguey hard to come near, and it uses up such a store of specimens. I am hard put to it, to get enough, notwithstanding the sailors I have from ye Indies. Ye people about are become curious, but I can stand them off. Ye gentry are worse than ye populace, being more circumstantial in their accounts, and more believed in what they tell. That parson and Mr. Merritt have talked some. I am fearful, but no thing so far is dangerous. Ye chemical substances are easy of getting, there being 2 good chemists in town, Dr. Bowen and Sam Carew. I'm following out what Borellus saith, and have help in Abdul al-Hazred, his 7th book. Whatever I get you shall have, and in ye meanwhile do not neglect to make use of ye words I have here given. I have them right, but if you desire to see him, employ the writings on ye piece of that I am putting in this packet. Say ye verses every Roodmas and Hallows Eve, and if your line run not out, one shall be in years to come that shall look back and use what salts or stuff. For salts you shall leave him. Job 14th. I rejoice you are again at Salem, and hope I may see you not long hence. I have a good stallion, and am thinking of getting a coach. There being one, Mr. Merritt's, in Providence already, though ye roads are bad. If you are disposed to travel, do not pass me by. From Boston take ye Post Road, through Dedham, Rentham, and Attleboro, good taverns being at all these towns. Stop at Mr. Balcom's in Wretham, where ye beds are finer than Mr. Hatch's, but eat at ye other house, for their cook is better. Turn into Providence, by Pawtucket Falls, and ye rode past Mr. Sale's Tavern, my house opposite Mr. Epentus Olney's Tavern, off ye Town Street, first on ye north side of Olney's Court, distance from Boston Stone about 44 miles. Sir, I am your old and true friend and servant, in Almosin, Metraton, Josephus C.
Young Ward came home in a state of pleasant excitement, and spent the following Saturday in a long and exhaustive study of the house in Olney Court. The place, now crumbling with age, had never been a mansion, but was a modest 2.5-story wooden townhouse of the familiar Providence colonial type, with plain peaked roof, large central chimney, and artistically carved doorway with rayed fanlight, triangular pediment, and trim Doric pilasters. It had suffered but little alteration externally, and Ward felt he was gazing on something very close to the sinister matters of his quest. The present African native inhabitants were known to him, and he was very courteously shown about the interior by old Asa and his stout wife Hannah. Here there was more change than the outside indicated, and Ward saw with regret that fully half of the fine scroll and urn overmantels and shelf-carved cupboard linings were gone, whilst much of the fine wainscoting and Bollection moulding was marked, hacked, and gouged, or covered up altogether with cheap wallpaper. It was exciting to stand within the ancestral walls, which had housed such a man of horror as Joseph Curwen. He saw with a thrill that a monogram had been very carefully effaced from the ancient brass knocker. From then until after the close of school, Ward spent his time on the photostatic copy of the Hutchinson cipher and the accumulation of local Curwen data. The former still proved unyielding, but of the latter he obtained so much, and so many clues to similar data elsewhere, that he was ready by July to make a trip to New London and New York, to consult old letters whose presence in those places was indicated. His trip was very fruitful, for it brought him the Fenner letters with their terrible description of the Pawtuxet farmhouse raid, and the Nightingale Talbot letters in which he learned of the portrait painted on a panel of the Curwen Library. This matter of the portrait interested him particularly, since he would have given much to know just what Joseph Curwen looked like, and he decided to make a second search of the house in Olney Court, to see if there might not be some trace of the ancient features beneath peeling coats of later paint or layers of mouldy wallpaper. Early in August, that search took place, and Ward went carefully over the walls of every room sizable enough to have been, by any possibility, of the library of the evil builder. He paid especial attention to the large panels of such overmantels as still remained, and was keenly excited after about an hour, when, on a broad area about the fireplace in a spacious ground-floor room, he became certain that the surface brought out by the peeling of several coats of paint was sensibly darker than any ordinary interior paint, or the wood beneath it was likely to have been.
A few more careful tests with a thin knife, and he knew that he had come upon an oil portrait of great extent. With truly scholarly restraint, the youth did not risk the damage which an immediate attempt to uncover the hidden picture with the knife might have done, but just retired from the scene of his discovery to enlist expert help. In 3 days he returned with an artist of long experience, Mr. Walter C. Dwight, whose studio was near the foot of College Hill, and that accomplished restorer of paintings set to work at once, with proper methods and chemical substances. Old Asa and his wife were duly excited over their strange visitors, and were properly reimbursed for this invasion of their domestic hearth. As day by day the work of restoration progressed, Charles Ward looked on with growing interest at the lines and shades gradually unveiled after their long oblivion. Dwight had begun at the bottom. Hence, since the picture was a 3/4 length one, the face did not come out for some time. It was meanwhile seen that the subject was a spare, well-shaped man, with dark blue coat, embroidered waistcoat, black satin small clothes, and white silk stockings, seated in a carved chair against the background of a window with wharves and ships beyond. When the head came out, it was observed to bear a neat Albemarle wig, and to possess a thin, calm, undistinguished face, which seemed somehow familiar to both Ward and the artist. Only at the very last, though, did the restorer and his client begin to gasp with astonishment at the details of that lean, pallid visage, and to recognize with a touch of awe the dramatic trick which heredity had played. For it took the final bath of oil and the final stroke of the delicate scraper to bring out fully the expression which centuries had hidden, and to confront the bewildered Charles Dexter Ward, dweller in the past, with his own living features in the countenance of his horrible great-great-great-grandfather. Ward brought his parents to see the marvel he had uncovered, and his father at once determined to purchase the picture despite its execution on stationary panelling. The resemblance to the boy, despite an appearance of rather greater age, was marvellous, and it could be seen that through some trick of atavism, the physical contours of Joseph Curwen had found precise duplication after a century and a half. Mrs. Ward's resemblance to her ancestors was not at all marked, though she could recall relatives who had some of the facial characteristics shared by her son and the bygone Curwen. She did not relish the discovery, and told her husband that he had better burn the picture instead of bringing it home. There was, she averred, something unwholesome about it, not only intrinsically, but in its very resemblance to Charles M. Ward. To Charles, Mr. Ward, however, was a practical man of power and affairs, a cotton manufacturer with extensive mills at River Point in the Pawtuxet Valley, and not one to listen to feminine scruples. The picture impressed him mightily with its likeness to his son, and he believed the boy deserved it as a present. In this opinion, it is needless to say, Charles most heartily concurred. A few days later, Mr. Ward located the owner of the house, a small, rodent-featured person with a guttural accent, and obtained the whole mantle and overmantle bearing the picture at a curtly fixed price, which cut short the impending torrent of unctuous haggling. It now remained to take off the panelling and remove it to the Ward home, where provisions were made for its thorough restoration and installation, with an electric mock fireplace in Charles' third-floor study or library. To Charles was left the task of superintending this removal, and on the 28th of August he accompanied 2 expert workmen from the Crooker decorating firm to the house in Olney Court, where the mantle and portrait-bearing overmantle were detached with great care and precision for transportation in the company's motor truck. There was left a space of exposed brickwork, marking the chimney's course, and in this young Ward observed a cubical recess about 1 foot square, which must have lain directly behind the head of the portrait. He found, beneath the deep coatings of dust and soot, some loose, yellowed papers, a crude, thick copybook, and a few mouldering textile shreds which may have formed the ribbon binding the rest together. Blowing away the bulk of the dirt and cinders, he took up the book and looked at the bold inscription on its cover. It was in a hand which he had learned to recognize at the Essex Institute, and proclaimed the volume as The Journal and Notes of Joseph Curwen, Gent of Providence Plantation, late of Salem. Excited beyond measure by his discovery, Ward showed the book to the two curious workmen beside him. Their testimony is absolute as to the nature and genuineness of the finding, and Dr. Willett relies on them to help establish his theory that the youth was not mad when he began his major eccentricities. All the other papers were likewise in Curwen's handwriting, and one of them seemed especially portentous because of its inscription, "To him who shall come after, how he may get beyond time and ye spheres." Another was in a cipher, the same, Ward hoped, as the Hutchinson cipher which had hitherto baffled him. A third, and here the searcher rejoiced, seemed to be a key to the cipher, whilst the fourth and fifth were addressed respectively to Edward Hutchinson Armiger and Jedediah Orne Esquire, or their heir or heirs, or those representing them. The sixth and last was inscribed, Joseph Curwen, his life and travels between years 1678 and 1687, of whither he voyaged, where he stayed, whom he saw, and what he learned. We have now reached the point from which the more academic school of alienists date Charles Ward's madness. Upon his discovery, the youth had looked immediately at a few of the inner pages of the book and manuscripts, and had evidently seen something which impressed him tremendously. Upon returning home, he broke the news with an almost embarrassed air, as if he wished to convey an idea of its supreme importance without having to exhibit the evidence itself. He did not even show the titles to his parents, but simply told them that he had found some documents in Joseph Curwen's handwriting, mostly in cipher, which would have to be studied very carefully before yielding up their true meaning. It is unlikely that he would have shown what he did to the workmen, had it not been for their unconcealed curiosity. As it was, he doubtless wished to avoid any display of peculiar reticence, which would increase their discussion of the matter. That night Charles Ward sat up in his room reading the new-found book and papers. And when day came, he did not desist. His meals, on his urgent request, when his mother called to see what was amiss, were sent up to him, and in the afternoon he appeared only briefly when the men came to install the Curwen picture and mantelpiece in his study. The next night he slept in snatches in his clothes, meanwhile wrestling feverishly with the unravelling of the cipher manuscript. In the morning his mother saw that he was at work on the photostatic copy of the Hutchinson cipher, which had frequently showed her before. But in response to her query, he said that the Curwen key could not be applied to it. That afternoon he abandoned his work and watched the men fascinatedly as they finished their installation of the picture, with his woodwork above a cleverly realistic electric log, setting the mock fireplace and overmantel a little out from the north wall as if a chimney existed, boxing in its sides with panelling to match the rooms. After the workmen went, he moved his work into the study and sat down before it with his eyes half on the cipher and half on the portrait, which stared back at him like a year-adding century-recalling mirror. His parents, subsequently recalling his conduct at this period, give interesting details anent the policy of concealment which he practiced. Before servants he seldom hid any paper which he might be studying, since he rightly assumed that Curwen's intricate and archaic chirography would be too much for them. With his parents, however, he was more circumspect, and unless the manuscript in question were a cipher or a mere mass of cryptic symbols and unknown ideographs, as that entitled "To him who shall come after," etc., seemed to be, he would cover it with some convenient paper until his caller had departed. At night he kept the papers under lock and key in an antique cabinet of his, where he also placed them whenever he left the room. He soon resumed fairly regular hours and habits, except that his long walks and other outside interests seemed to cease. The opening of school, where he now began his senior year, seemed a great bore to him, and he frequently asserted his determination never to bother with college. He had, he said, important special investigations to make, which would provide him with more avenues toward knowledge and the humanities than any university which the world could boast. During October, Ward began visiting the libraries again, but no longer for the antiquarian matter of his former days. Witchcraft and magic, occultism and demonology were what he sought now. and when Providence sources proved unfruitful, he would take the train for Boston and tap the wealth of the great library in Copley Square, the Widener Library at Harvard, or the Zion Research Library in Brooklyn, where certain rare works on biblical subjects are available. He bought extensively and fitted up a whole additional set of shelves in his study for newly acquired works on uncanny subjects, while during the Christmas holidays he made a round of out-of-town trips, including one to Salem, to consult certain records at the Essex Institute. About the middle of January 1920, there entered Ward's bearing an element of triumph which he did not explain, and he was no more found at work upon the Hutchinson cipher. Instead, he inaugurated a dual policy of chemical research and record scanning, fitting up for the one a library in the unused attic of the house, and for the latter haunting all the sources of vital statistics in Providence. Local dealers in drugs and scientific supplies, later questioned, gave astonishingly queer and meaningless catalogues of these substances and instruments he purchased. But clerks at the State House, the City Hall, and the various libraries agree as to the definite object of his second interest. He was searching intensely and feverishly for the grave of Joseph Curwen, from whose slate slab an older generation had so wisely blotted the name. Little by little there grew upon the Ward family the conviction that something was wrong. His schoolwork was the merest pretense. He had other concernments now, and, when not in his new laboratory, with a score of obsolete alchemical books, could be found either poring over old burial records downtown or glued to his volumes of occult lore in his study, where the startlingly, one almost fancied increasingly, similar features of Joseph Curwen stared blandly at him from the great overmantel on the north wall. Late in March, Ward added to his archive searching a ghoulish series of rambles about the various ancient cemeteries of the city. His quest had suddenly shifted from the grave of Joseph Curwen to that of one Naphtali Field, and this shift was explained when, upon going over the files that he had been over, the investigators actually found a fragmentary record of Curwen's burial, which had escaped the general obliteration and which stated that the curious leaden coffin had been interred 10 feet south and 5 foot west of Naphtali's Field's grave in Ye. Hence the rambles, from which St. John's, the former king's, churchyard and the ancient congregational burying ground in the midst of Swan Point Cemetery were excluded, since other statistics had shown that the only Naphtali Field, obituary 1729, whose grave could have been meant, had been a Baptist. It was toward May when Dr. Willett, at the request of the senior ward, had fortified with all the Curwen data which the family had gleaned from Charles in his non-secretive days, talked with the young man. The interview was of little value or conclusiveness, for Willett felt at every moment that Charles was thoroughly master of himself and in touch with matters of real importance. But it at last forced the secretive youth to offer some rational explanation of his recent demeanour. Of a pallid, impassive type not easily showing embarrassment, Ward seemed quite ready to discuss his pursuits, though not to reveal their object. He stated that the papers of his ancestor had contained some remarkable secrets of early scientific knowledge. To take their vivid place in the history of human thought, they must first be correlated by one familiar with the background out of which they evolved, and to this task of correlation Ward was now devoting himself. He was seeking to acquire as fast as possible those neglected arts of old which a true interpreter of the Curwen data must possess, and hoped in time to make a full announcement and presentation of the utmost interest to mankind and to the world of thought. As to his graveyard search, whose object he freely admitted, but the details of whose progress he did not relate, he said he had reason to think that Joseph Curwen's mutilated headstone bore certain mystic symbols, carved from directions in his will and ignorantly spared by those who had effaced the name, which were absolutely essential to the final solution of his cryptic system. Curwen, he believed, had wished to guard his secret with care, and had consequently distributed the data in an exceedingly curious fashion. When Dr. Willett asked to see the mystic documents, Ward displayed much reluctance and tried to put him off with such things as the photostatic copies of the Hutchinson cipher an own formulae and diagrams, but finally showed him the exteriors of some of the real Curwen finds, the journal and notes, the cipher, title in cipher also, and the formula-filled message, "To him who shall come after," and let him glance inside such as we were in obscure characters. He also opened the diary at a page carefully selected for its innocuousness, and gave Willett a glimpse of Curwen's connected handwriting in English. The doctor noted very closely the crabbed and complicated letters, and the general aura of the 17th century which clung around both penmanship and style, despite the writer's survival into the 18th century, and became quickly certain that the document was genuine. Text itself was relatively trivial, and Willett recalled only a fragment. But when Dr. Willett turned the leaf, he was quickly checked by Ward, who almost snatched the book from his grasp. All that the doctor had a chance to see on the newly opened page was a brief pair of sentences, but these, strangely enough, lingered tenaciously in his memory. They ran: "Ye verse, from Liber Damnatus, being spoke 5 Rudmasses and 4 Hallows Eves, I'm hopeful ye thing is breeding outside ye spheres. It will draw one who is to come if I can make sure he shall be, and he shall think on past things, and look back through all ye years, against ye which I must have ready ye salts, or to that to make 'em with." Willett saw no more, but somehow this small glimpse gave a new and vague terror to the painted features of Joseph Curwen, which stared blandly down from the overmantel. Ever after that he entertained the odd fancy, with his medical skill of course assured him was only a fancy, that the eyes of the portrait had a sort of tendency to follow young Charles Ward as he moved about the room. He stopped before leaving to study the picture closely, marvelling at its resemblance to Charles and memorizing every minute detail of the cryptical, colourless face, even down to a slight scar or pit in the smooth brow above the right eye. Assured by the doctor that Charles' mental health was in no danger, but that on the other hand he was engaged in researches which might prove of real importance, the Wards were more lenient than they might otherwise have been, when during the following June the youth made positive his refusal to attend college. He had, he declared, studies of much more vital importance to pursue, and intimated a wish to go abroad the following year in order to avail himself of certain sources of data not existing in America. The senior Ward, while denying this latter wish as absurd for a boy of only 18, acquiesced regarding the university, so that after a none too brilliant graduation from the Moses Brown School, there ensued for Charles a 3-year period of intensive occult study and graveyard searching. Coming of age in April 1923, and having previously inherited a small competence from his maternal grandfather, Ward determined at last to take the European trip hitherto denied him. Of his proposed itinerary he would say nothing, save that the needs of his studies would carry him to many places, but he promised to write his parents fully and faithfully. When they saw he could not be dissuaded, they ceased all opposition and helped as best they could, so that in June the young man sailed for Liverpool, with the farewell blessings of his father and mother, who accompanied him to Boston and waved him out of sight from the White Star Pier in Charlestown. Later soon told of his safe arrival, and of his securing good quarters in Great Russell Street, London, where he proposed to stay, shunning all family friends, till he had exhausted the resources of the British Museum in a certain direction. Of his daily life he wrote but little, for there was little to write. Study and experiment consumed all his time, and he mentioned a laboratory which he had established in one of his rooms. That he said nothing of antiquarian rambles in the glamorous old city with its luring skyline of ancient domes and steeples, and its tangles of roads and alleys whose mystic convolutions and sudden vistas alternately beckon and surprise, was taken by his parents as a good index of the degree to which his new interest had engrossed his mind. In June 1924, a brief note told of his departure for Paris, to which he had before made 1 or 2 flying trips for material in the Bibliothèque Nationale.
For 3 months thereafter, he sent only postcards, giving an address in the Rue Saint-Jacques, and referring to a special search among rare manuscripts in the library of an unnamed private collector. He avoided acquaintances, and no tourist brought back reports of having seen him. Then came a silence, and in October the Wards received a picture card from Prague, Czechoslovakia, stating that Charles was in that ancient town for the purpose of conferring with a certain very aged man, supposed to be the last living possessor of some very curious medieval information. He gave an address in the Neustadt, and announced no move till the following January, when he dropped several cards from Vienna telling of his passage through that city on the way toward a more easterly region, whither one of his correspondents and fellow delvers into the occult had invited him. The next card was from Klausenburg in Transylvania, and told of Ward's progress towards his destination. He was going to visit a Baron Ferenczi, whose estate lay in the mountains east of Racus, and was to be addressed as Racus in the care of that nobleman. Another card from Racus a week later, saying that his host's carriage had met him and that he was leaving the village for the mountains, was his last message for a considerable time. Indeed, he did not reply to his parents' frequent letters until May, when he wrote to discourage the plan of his mother for a meeting in London, Paris, or Rome during the summer, when the elder Wards were planning to travel in Europe. His researches, he said, were such that he could not leave his present quarters, while the situation of Baron Ferenczi's castle did not favour visits. It was on a crag in the dark wooded mountains, and the region was so shunned by the country folk that normal people could not help feeling ill at ease. Moreover, the Baron was not a person likely to appeal to correct and conservative New England gentlefolk. His aspect and manners had idiosyncrasies, and his age was so great as to be disquieting. It would be better, Charles said, if his parents would wait for his return to Providence, which could scarcely be far distant. That return did not, however, take place until May 1925, when after a few heralding cards the young wanderer quietly slipped into New York on the Homeric and traversed the long miles to Providence by motor coach, eagerly drinking in the green rolling hills, the fragrant blossoming orchards, and the white steepled towns of Connecticut in spring. His first taste of ancient New England in nearly 4 years. Old Providence! It was this place, and the mysterious forces of its long continuous history, which had brought him into being, and which had drawn him back toward marvels and secrets whose boundaries no prophet might fix. Here lay the arcana, wondrous or dreadful as the case might be, for which all his years of travel and application had been preparing him. A taxicab whirled him through Post Office Square, with its glimpse of the river, and up the steep curved slope of Waterman Street to Prospect. Then 8 squares past the fine old estates his childish eyes had known, and the quaint brick sidewalk so often trodden by his youthful feet, and at last the little white overtaken farmhouse on the right, and on the left the classic Adam porch and stately bayed facade of the great brick house where he was born. It was twilight, and Charles Dexter Ward had come home. Ward was now visibly aged and hardened, but was still normal in his general reactions, and in several talks with Willett displayed a balance which no madman, even an incipient one, could feign continuously for long. What elicited the notion of insanity at this period were the sounds heard at all hours from Ward's attic laboratory, in which he kept himself most of the time. There were chantings and repetitions, and thunderous declamations in uncanny rhythms, and although these sounds were always in Ward's own voice, there was something in the quality of that voice, and in the accents of the formulae it pronounced, which could not but chill the blood of every hearer. It was noticed that Nig, the venerable and beloved black cat of the household, bristled and arched his back perceptibly when certain of the tones were heard. The odours occasionally wafted from the laboratory were likewise exceedingly strange. Sometimes they were very noxious, but more often they were aromatic, with a haunting, elusive quality which seemed to have the power of inducing fantastic images.
People who smelled them had a tendency to glimpse momentary mirages of enormous vistas, with strange hills or endless avenues of sphinxes and hippogriffs stretching off into infinite distance. His older aspect increased to a startling degree. His resemblance to the Curwen portrait in his library, and Dr. Willett would often pause by the latter after a call, marvelling at the virtual identity and reflecting that only the small pit above the picture's right eye now remained to differentiate the long-dead wizard from the living youth. Frequently he noted peculiar things about, little wax images of grotesque design on the shelves or tables, and the half-erased remnants of circles, triangles, and pentagrams in chalk or charcoal on the cleared central space of the large room. And always in the night those rhythms and incantations thundered, till it became very difficult to keep servants or suppress furtive talk of Charles' madness. In January 1927, a peculiar incident occurred. One night about midnight, as Charles was chanting a ritual whose weird cadence echoed unpleasantly through the house below, there came a sudden gust of chill wind from the bay, and a faint, obscure trembling of the earth which everyone in the neighbourhood noted. At the same time, the cat exhibited phenomenal traces of fright, while dogs bayed for as much as a mile around. This was the prelude to a sharp thunderstorm, anomalous for the season, which brought with it such a crash that Mr. and Mrs. Ward believed the house had been struck. They rushed upstairs to see what damage had been done, but Charles met them at the door to the attic, pale, resolute, and portentous, with an almost fearsome combination of triumph and seriousness on his face. He assured them that the house had not really been struck, and that the storm would soon be over, sank to a sort of dull, mumbling chuckle, and finally died away. Stars came out, and the stamp of triumph on Charles Ward's face crystallized into a very singular expression. For 2 months or more after this incident, Ward was less confined than usual to his laboratory. He exhibited a curious interest in the weather and made odd inquiries about the date of the spring thawing of the ground. One night, late in March, he left the house after midnight and did not return till almost morning, when his mother, being wakeful, heard a rumbling motor draw up the carriage entrance. Muffled oaths could be distinguished, and Mrs. Ward, rising and going to the window, saw 4 dark figures removing a long, heavy box from a truck at Charles' direction and carrying it within by the side door. She heard laboured breathing and ponderous footfalls on the stairs, and finally a dull thumping in the attic, after which the footfalls descended again, and the 4 men reappeared outside and drove off in their truck. The next day, Charles resumed his strict attic seclusion, drawing down the dark shades of his laboratory windows and appearing to be working on some metal substance. He would open the door to no one and steadfastly refuse all proffered food. About noon, a wrenching sound followed by a terrible cry and a fall were heard. But when Mrs. Ward rapped at the door, her son at length answered faintly and told her that nothing had gone amiss. The hideous and indescribable stench now welling out was absolutely harmless, and unfortunately necessary. Solitude was the one prime essential, and he would appear later for dinner. That afternoon, after the conclusion of some odd hissing sounds which came from behind the locked portal, he did finally appear, wearing an extremely haggard aspect, and forbidding anyone to enter the laboratory upon any pretext. This indeed proved the beginning of a new policy of secrecy, for never afterward was any person permitted to visit either the mysterious garret workroom or the adjacent storeroom which he cleared out, furnished roughly and added to his inviolably private domain as a sleeping apartment. Here he lived, with books brought up from his library beneath, till the time he purchased a Pawtuxet bungalow and moved to it all his scientific effects. In the evening, Charles secured the paper before the rest of the family and damaged part of it through an apparent accident. Later on, Dr. Willett, having fixed the date from statements by various members of the household, looked up an intact copy at the Journal office and found that in the destroyed section the following small item had occurred. Nocturnal diggers surprised in North Burial Ground Robert Hart. night watchman at the North Burial Ground, this morning discovered a party of several men with a motor truck in the oldest part of the cemetery, but apparently frightened them off before they had accomplished whatever their object may have been. The discovery took place at about 4 o'clock, when Hart's attention was attracted by the sound of a motor outside his shelter. Investigating, he saw a large truck on the main drive several rods away, but could not reach it before the sound of his feet on the gravel had revealed his approach. The men hastily placed a large box in the truck and drove away toward the street before they could be overtaken. And since no known grave was disturbed, Hart believes that this box was an object which they wished to bury. The diggers must have been at work for a long while before detection, for Hart found an enormous hole dug at a considerable distance back from the roadway in the lot of a Mosa field, where most of the old stones have long disappeared. The hole, a place as large and deep as a grave, was empty. It did not coincide with any interment mentioned in the cemetery records. Sergeant Riley of the 2nd Station viewed the spot and gave the opinion that the hole was dug by bootleggers, rather gruesomely and ingeniously, seeking a safe cache for liquor in a place not likely to be disturbed. In reply to questions, Hart said he thought the escaping truck had headed up Rochambeau Avenue, though he could not be sure. During the next few days, Charles Ward was seldom seen by his family, having added sleeping quarters to his attic realm. He kept closely to himself there, ordering food brought to the door, and not taking it in until after the servant had gone away. The droning of monotonous formulae and the chanting of bizarre rhythms recurred at intervals, while at other times occasional listeners could detect the sound of tinkling glass, hissing chemicals, running water, or roaring gas flames. Odours of the most implacable quality, wholly unlike any before noted, hung at times around the door, and the air of tension observable in the young recluse whenever he did venture briefly forth was such as to excite the keenest speculation. Once he made a hasty trip to the Athenaeum for a book he required, and again he hired a messenger to fetch him a highly obscure volume from Boston. Suspense was written portentously over the whole situation, and both the family and Dr. Willett confessed themselves wholly at a loss what to do or think about it. On the 15th of April, a strange development occurred. While nothing appeared to grow different in kind, there was certainly a very terrible difference in degree, and Dr. Willett somehow attaches great significance to the change. The day was Good Friday, a circumstance of which the servants made much, but which others quite naturally dismiss as an irrelevant coincidence. Late in the afternoon, young Ward began repeating a certain formula in a singularly loud voice, at the same time burning some substance so pungent that its fumes escaped over the entire house. The formula was so plainly audible in the hall outside the locked door that Mrs. Ward could not help memorizing it as she waited and listened anxiously. Later on, she was able to write it down at Dr. Willett's request. It ran as follows, and experts have told Dr. Willett that its very close analogue can be found in the mystic writings of Eliphas, Levi, that cryptic soul who crept through a crack in the forbidden door and glimpsed the frightful vistas of the void beyond. Per Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, Metraton, O Agla Methon, Verbum Pythonicum, Mysterium Salamandre, Conventus Silvorum, Antra, Nomorum, Demonia Coli God, Almon Sin, Gibor, Yeshua, Evam, Zariet Natmik, Veni, Veni, Veni. This had been going on for 2 hours, without change or intermission, when over all the neighbourhood a pandemoniac howling of dogs set in. The extent of this howling can be judged from the space it received in the papers the next day, but to those in the Ward household it was overshadowed by the odour which instantly followed it. A hideous, all-pervasive odour which none of them had ever smelt before, or have ever smelt since. In the midst of this mephitic flood, there came a very perceptible flash, like that of lightning, which would have been blinding and impressive but for the daylight around. And then was heard the voice that no listener can ever forget because of its thunderous remoteness, its incredible depth, and its eldritch dissimilarity to Charles Ward's voice. It shook the house, and was clearly heard by at least 2 neighbours above the howling of the dogs. Mrs. Ward, who had been listening in despair outside her son's locked laboratory, shivered as she recognized its hellish import, for Charles had told her of its evil fame in dark books, and of the manner in which it had thundered, according to the Fenner letters, above the doomed Pawtuxet farmhouse on the night of Joseph Curwen's annihilation. There was no mistaking that nightmare phrase, for Charles had described it too vividly in the old days when he had talked frankly of his Curwen investigations, and yet it was only this fragment of an archaic and forgotten language. Dies, mies, jesset, bon, boene, doesef, duevima, enitemaus. Close upon this thundering there came a momentary darkening of the daylight, though sunset was still an hour distant, and then a puff of added odour, different from the first but equally unknown and intolerable. Charles was chanting again now, and his mother could hear syllables: Yi naga, yog, sothoth, he, legleb, fi, throdag, ending in a ya, whose maniacal force mounted in an ear-splitting crescendo. A second later, all previous memories were effaced by the wailing scream which burst out with frantic explosiveness and gradually changed form to a paroxysm of diabolic and hysterical laughter. Mrs. Ward, with the mingled fear and blind courage of maternity, advanced and knocked affrightedly at the concealing panels, but obtained no sign of recognition. She knocked again, but paused nervously as a second shriek arose, this one unmistakable in the familiar voice of her son, and sounding concurrently with the still bursting cachinnations of that other voice. Presently she fainted, although she is still unable to recall the precise and immediate cause. Memory sometimes makes merciful deletions. Mr. Ward returned from the business section at about 6:15, and not finding his wife downstairs, was told by the frightened servants that she was probably watching at Charles' door, from which the sounds had been far stranger than ever before. Mounting the stairs at once, he saw Mrs. Ward stretched at full length on the floor of the corridor outside the laboratory, and realizing that she had fainted, hastened to fetch a glass of water from a set bowl in a neighbouring alcove. Dashing the cold fluid in her face, he was heartened to observe an immediate response on her part, and was watching the bewildered opening of her eyes when a chill shot through him and threatened to reduce him to the very state from which she was emerging. For the seemingly silent laboratory was not as silent as it had appeared to be, but held the murmurs of a tense, muffled conversation in tones too low for comprehension, yet of a quality profoundly disturbing to the soul. It was not, of course, new for Charles to mutter formulae, but this muttering was definitely different. It was so palpably a dialogue or imitation of a dialogue, with the regular alternation of inflections suggesting question and answer, statement and response. One voice was undisguisedly that of Charles, but the other had a depth and hollowness which the youth's best powers of ceremonial mimicry had scarcely approached before. There was something hideous, blasphemous, and abnormal about it, and but for a cry from his recovering wife which cleared his mind by arousing his protective instincts, it is not likely that Theodore Howland Ward could have maintained nearly a year more his old boast that he had never fainted. As it was, he seized his wife in his arms and bore her quickly downstairs before she could notice the voices which had so horribly disturbed him. Even so, however, he was not quick enough to escape catching something himself, which caused him to stagger dangerously with his burden, for Mrs. Ward's cry had evidently been heard by others than he, and there had come in response to it from behind the locked door the first distinguishable words which that hushed and terrible colloquy had yielded. They were merely an excited caution in Charles' own voice, but somehow their implications had a nameless fright for the father who overheard them. The phrase was just this: "Shh! Right!" Mrs. and Mrs. Ward conferred at some length after dinner, and the former resolved to have a firm and serious talk with Charles that very night. No matter how important the object, such conduct could no longer be permitted, for these latest developments transcended every limit of sanity and formed a menace to the order and nervous well-being of the entire household. The youth must indeed have taken complete leave of his senses, since only downright madness could have prompted the wild screams and imaginary conversations in assumed voices which the present day had brought forth. All this must be stopped, or Mrs. Ward would be made ill, and the keeping of servants become an impossibility. Mr. Ward rose at the close of the meal and started upstairs for Charles' laboratory. On the third floor, however, he paused at the sounds which he heard proceeding from the now disused library of his son. Books were apparently being flung about and papers wildly rustled, and upon stepping to the door, Mr. Ward beheld the youth within, excitedly assembling a vast armful of literary matter of every size and shape. Charles' aspect was very drawn and haggard, and he dropped his entire load with a start at the sound of his father's voice. At the elder man's command he sat down and for some time listened to the admonitions he had so long deserved. There was no scene. At the end of the lecture he agreed that his father was right, and that his noises, mutterings, incantations, and chemical odours were indeed inexcusable nuisances. For the fright and fainting of his mother he expressed the keenest contrition, and explained that the conversation later heard was part of an elaborate symbolism designed to create a certain mental atmosphere. His use of abstruse chemical terms somewhat bewildered Mr. Ward, but the parting impression was one of undeniable sanity and poise, despite a mysterious tension of the utmost gravity. Mr. Ward hardly knew what to make of the entire business. It was as mysterious as the death of poor old Nig, whose stiffening form had been found an hour before in the basement, with staring eyes and fear-distorted mouth. Driven by some vague detective instinct, the bewildered parent now glanced curiously at the vacant shelves to see what his son had taken up to the attic. The youth's library was plainly and rigidly classified, so that one might tell at a glance the books, or at least the kind of books, which had been withdrawn. On this occasion Mr. Ward was astonished to find that nothing of the occult or the antiquarian, beyond what had been previously removed, was missing. These new withdrawals were all modern items, histories, scientific treatises, geographies, manuals of literature, philosophic works, and certain contemporary newspapers and magazines. It was a very curious shift from Charles Ward's recent run of reading, and the father paused in a growing vortex of perplexity and an engulfing sense of strangeness. The strangeness was a very poignant sensation, and almost clawed at his chest as he strove to see just what was wrong around him. Something was indeed wrong, and tangibly as well as spiritually so. On the north wall rose still the ancient carved overmantel from the house in Olney Court. But to the cracked and precariously restored oils of the large Curwen portrait disaster had come. Time and unequal heating had done their work at last, and at some time since the room's last cleaning the worst had happened. Peeling clear of the wood, curling tighter and tighter, and finally crumbling into small bits with what must have been malignly silent suddenness. The portrait of Joseph Curwen had resigned forever its staring surveillance of the youth it so strangely resembled, and now lay scattered on the floor, as a thin coating of fine bluish-grey dust. You've been listening to Part 2 of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P. Lovecraft. Tonight's chapter has carried us further into Lovecraft's world of forbidden resurrection, hidden laboratories and ancient horrors waiting patiently beneath the surface of ordinary life. But the darkest revelations are still to come. Be sure to return for Part 3, where the dreadful truth behind Charles Dexter Ward and Joseph Curwen will finally emerge from the shadows. Until next time, thank you for listening. And remember this: the dead may rest quietly for centuries, but some are only waiting to be called back. Good night. This has been The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, Part 2, written by H.P. Lovecraft. Performed for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1941. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne.